This is the story of how $55 million in United States Army salary payments got quietly rerouted through a network of shell companies before the FBI and Homeland Security investigations caught up with it. This account is built from patterns seen across real federal payroll fraud and shell company investigations. What looked, on paper, like ordinary military payroll turned out to be a diversion scheme running for years, and the people behind it were counting on nobody checking the paperwork closely enough to notice. This case matters because it didn't target a weapons contract or a base commissary. It targeted the most basic function of the Army itself, which is paying its own soldiers. For nearly 4 years, the scheme ran quietly inside one of the largest payroll systems in the federal government, hidden among hundreds of thousands of legitimate transactions processed every single pay period. Understanding how a scheme like this survives for years means understanding the machinery it was hiding inside. Soldier salaries move through the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, known as DFAS, which processes pay for active duty, reserve, and National Guard personnel across every branch of the military, handling millions of transactions a year and moving billions of dollars through a system built for speed and consistency rather than line-by-line human review. Payroll data flows from unit-level personnel systems up through DFAS, which cuts payments on a fixed bi-weekly schedule tied to Social Security numbers, unit codes, and bank routing information on file for each service member. Once a soldier gets entered into the personnel system with valid identifiers, that entry becomes largely self-sustaining, and pay continues flowing automatically every cycle unless something specifically flags it for review. The whole system rests on one assumption, that the people entering and approving payroll data are who they say they are, and that the units and personnel listed are real. It's built on trust in its own inputs, because checking every entry by hand at that scale simply isn't realistic. A senior administrative clerk assigned to a personnel processing unit at Fort Bragg had exactly the kind of access that assumption depended on, and investigators would later determine he'd been quietly abusing it since early 2021, years before anyone noticed the pattern. 14 shell companies sat at the center of the scheme, built to look like legitimate logistics and administrative contractors tied to Army operations. Nothing about them was designed to look exotic or suspicious. No offshore paperwork, no foreign bank accounts, just enough to pass a basic level of scrutiny. Registered addresses in North Carolina and Georgia, functioning bank accounts, filed articles of incorporation, documentation solid enough to survive a routine check without inviting a closer look. Daniel Reyes Corvin, the clerk named in charging documents, allegedly created 340 fictitious personnel entries in the Army's database over roughly 3.5 years. Soldiers who existed on paper but not in any actual unit formation. Rank, assigned unit, duty station. Each fictitious entry carried a plausible service record with enough surrounding detail that a routine glance wouldn't raise questions, and each one carried a routing number that led not to a real service member's bank account but to one of the 14 shell companies. Investigators nicknamed the network the Ghost Battalion and the name fit, because the fake entries together resembled a fully staffed unit, complete with a chain of command, personnel numbers, and promotion timelines that didn't exist anywhere outside a database. On paper, it looked like several hundred soldiers doing their jobs. What it actually was a payroll pipeline built to move money out the back door. Corvine didn't run the financial side alone. 2 civilian associates, Patrice Hall Whitfield and Marcus Delgado Reyes, allegedly set up and managed the shell company's banking on his behalf, and their roles split cleanly down the middle. Whitfield filed the paperwork, opened the bank accounts, and kept the shell companies looking active enough to dodge scrutiny from state regulators, while Delgado Reyes managed the accounts receiving and moving the diverted funds, spreading transfers across the network in patterns built to avoid triggering the large transaction reporting banks are required to flag. No single dramatic discovery unraveled this scheme. It surfaced the way most large-scale financial fraud does, through anomalies that piled up until they became too consistent to ignore. A routine DFAS reconciliation in mid-2024 flagged an unusually high volume of payroll disbursements tied to a personnel roster segment that hadn't been cross-verified against actual unit rosters in over 2 years. That kind of gap isn't unheard of in a system this large, but once flagged, it triggered a deeper audit, and auditors began the slow work of manually matching personnel entries against real duty station assignments, pulling individual records and checking them against unit rosters one by one. The pattern that emerged grew more troubling the further they dug. Roughly 340 personnel entries didn't correspond to any soldier who'd ever reported for duty at the units listed. No physical presence, no training records, no equipment issued, nothing beyond the payroll entry itself. Once that thread got pulled, the discrepancy came into focus fast, and investigators tracing those fictitious entries back through years of disbursement records landed on a number just over $55 million in salary payments since the scheme began. Money that had left the Treasury believing it was compensating real soldiers for real service. Once the internal audit findings got referred out, the case moved from an accounting anomaly to a criminal investigation, and that's where the FBI and Homeland Security investigations stepped in. Tracing the diverted funds fell to the FBI, mapping how money moved out of the 14 shell company accounts once it landed, following it through subsequent transfers, and identifying who ultimately controlled and benefited from each one. Pulling bank records, matching account signatories, reconstructing a financial trail transaction by transaction until a clear picture of the money's path emerges. That's patient, subpoena-driven work, and it rarely moves fast. HSI focused on the shell company's financial infrastructure, including several transfers that moved through accounts with international wire connections, activity that brought HSI's financial crimes expertise into the case alongside the FBI's Charlotte field office. The FBI worked the domestic fraud angle, and HSI's agents focused on how funds moved once they crossed into channels with cross-border exposure, an area where their financial investigative authority is particularly well-suited. Nearly a year went into building the complete financial trail, which shell companies received, which payments, which accounts those companies funneled money into next, and which individuals held signing authority or beneficial ownership over each one. By the time the case was ready to move from investigation to enforcement, agents had mapped a network of 22 bank accounts spread across 6 different financial institutions, a sprawling structure deliberately fragmented to make the money trail as difficult to follow as possible. October 14, 2025, that's when the operation moved into its execution phase. FBI and HSI agents executed coordinated search warrants at 5 locations simultaneously, hitting Corvin's residence in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 2 business addresses tied to the shell companies in Charlotte, and the residences belonging to Whitfield and Delgado Reyes. Financial records, laptops and phones, corporate formation documents, banking materials tied to the shell network. Agents seized all of it. The physical and digital paper trail that would ultimately support the charges against all 3 defendants. Corvin was taken into custody at his residence during the raid, and Whitfield and Delgado Reyes were arrested that same day at their respective addresses, closing out a scheme that had run undisturbed for the better part of 4 years. For everyone involved, the raid marked the first moment they realized the operation had been fully unwound. Years of careful compartmentalization undone in a single coordinated morning. Corvin, 41 years old, had spent nearly a decade in an administrative role handling personnel records before investigators say he began exploiting that access in 2021. His position gave him legitimate, routine reasons to create and modify personnel entries, and that's exactly the access the scheme depended on, which is also why it took so long to detect. Neither Whitfield, 38, nor Delgado Reyes, 44, had any military affiliation themselves. Prosecutors described them as civilian associates recruited specifically to build and operate the financial side once Corvin had the fraudulent entries in place, providing the corporate and banking infrastructure that turned fictitious payroll data into real, spendable money. Technical sophistication in any dramatic sense wasn't what made this scheme function. It was patience, division of labor, and a precise read on exactly how far a payroll system's checks could be pushed before triggering a flag. All 3 defendants now face charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and money laundering, filed by federal prosecutors following the raid. Corvin faces an additional charge of theft of government funds tied directly to his access and manipulation of Army personnel records to generate the fraudulent entries at the center of the scheme. Up to 20 years on the wire fraud and money laundering counts awaits each defendant if convicted, with Corvin facing additional exposure on the theft of government funds charge, given his direct role in originating the fraud. Late October 2025 brought arraignment for all 3 defendants in the Eastern District of North Carolina, and each has pleaded not guilty. The case sits in the pre-trial phase now, with a trial date set for early 2026, and pre-trial proceedings are expected to focus heavily on the financial records seized during the October raid, which prosecutors say will form the backbone of their case. Regardless of how the trial unfolds, one thing is already clear. $55 million in Army salary payments that were never supposed to leave the payroll system got redirected into a network built specifically to look legitimate long enough to avoid a second look for nearly 4 years. Military payroll fraud doesn't draw the same attention as a weapons contract scandal or a base-level corruption case, but the stakes run arguably higher in one specific way. It strikes at the trust every soldier has in the system that's supposed to pay them accurately and on time, every pay period, without question. $55 million, redirected through a network of shell companies built to mimic a real Army unit. That number exposes a gap between how large the payroll system is and how closely any part of it can realistically be monitored. It's not a failure of technology so much as a failure of the assumption the technology runs on, that the data entering the system is honest. Nearly a year of matching records, tracing accounts, and building a paper trail strong enough to hold up in federal court. That's the kind of work the FBI and HSI did here. The kind that rarely makes headlines while it's happening. The raid is the visible part, the part that makes the news. But everything that made the raid possible happened quietly, one subpoenaed record at a time, long before anyone outside the investigation knew the Ghost Battalion existed. Cases like this one rarely stay isolated once investigators start looking closely. A single insider with legitimate access, a slow escalation from small manipulations to a fully built-out fraud network, years of undetected operation before an unrelated audit stumbles onto the pattern. That's the arc payroll and personnel fraud schemes inside large government systems tend to follow. What makes the Ghost Battalion case useful isn't that it was unusually clever, it's that it shows how much damage patience and legitimate access can do inside a system too large to check line by line. Joint investigations between agencies like the FBI and HSI matter for exactly this reason. A scheme touching both a domestic fraud angle and a financial network with cross-border banking exposure doesn't fit neatly inside a single agency's jurisdiction, and mapping a structure like the 14-company shell network here took the FBI's fraud and public corruption expertise, working alongside HSI's Financial Crimes Authority, tracing every account, every transfer, every signatory back to a real person who can be held accountable. Procedural changes usually follow cases like this for DFAS and the Army more broadly. Tighter cross-referencing between personnel rosters and duty station records, more frequent reconciliation cycles, closer scrutiny of administrative staff with the kind of broad database access Corvin allegedly had. Those changes rarely make headlines either, but they're often the most lasting consequence. Not just the prosecutions, but the quiet tightening of a system that proved it could be exploited for years without anyone noticing. There's a financial recovery side to cases like this that gets less attention than the arrests too. Prosecutors typically pursue asset forfeiture alongside the criminal charges once accounts are identified and frozen, aiming to claw back whatever remains of the diverted funds before they're spent or moved beyond reach. And how much of $55 million is actually recoverable often comes down to how quickly investigators can freeze accounts once a scheme is identified. Money already spent, laundered through additional layers, or moved into assets is far harder to recover than funds still sitting in the original shell accounts. And that recovery process, when it happens, usually plays out long after the headlines from the raid have faded, in civil forfeiture filings that rarely get the same public attention as the arrests themselves. A scheme built entirely on paper, unraveled the same way. That's the story of the Ghost Battalion. And a reminder that even the most routine parts of a massive federal system are only as secure as the trust placed in the people who operate them.